everybody, for your patience as we reset the ballroom. We are now open and excited to have you come on in for the next session. Please make your way in, and we'll get started here momentarily. Thank you.
Please welcome our panel on Sovereign Wealth Funds, Lessons for the U.S., moderated by Caitlin McLean, Managing Director of Innovative Finance at the Milken Institute.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Come on in. It's not that cold in here, I swear. There's heaters. It's nice and warm, and there's caffeine. There's not, but it's okay. You have natural caffeine. Welcome, everyone. We're very excited. You just had a great lunch presentation. You've networked, and now you're going to hear about what might happen in the United States, the creation of a sovereign wealth fund. So we have 30 minutes. There's a lot to discuss. You may have seen different press releases over the past month and a half about this current administration's interest in putting together a sovereign wealth fund. There is a sprint right now to think about in the Treasury Department what that might look like in terms of how you capitalize it, what it might actually do, what it might invest in, what its mission might be. So there is a blank slate. Thankfully, we have a panel of experts here to talk about best practices from around the world, so that we can potentially think about how this might benefit the US. For those of you who don't know, the panelists, please look at their bios because we have 28 minutes, so we're not going to spend time doing introductions because they have a lot of amazing things to talk to you today about. So the sovereign wealth fund market, there's about 100, right? Is that your count? 100 different sovereign wealth funds. If you've seen one, you've seen one. So they come in different shapes and sizes. And so the idea here is to talk about what are some of those best practices of those shapes and sizes. So Victoria, why don't we start with you first to kind of give everyone a sense of kind of where sovereign wealth funds, obviously over the past 30, 40 years, have evolved to become in the trillions of $9 trillion in assets under management, kind of what that looks like now and what some of those kind of best practices you've seen, whether it's a natural resources fund, a savings fund, a development fund. Talk a little bit about kind of the lay of the land there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of us think about a sovereign wealth fund as being kind of a fund to invest internationally for intergenerational savings, and usually from natural resource revenues where you have a fiscal surplus. And we still have quite a few of those funds. About half of IFSWF's members are, in fact, those kind of funds. But really, since we were founded in 2008, what we've seen is a real innovation evolution of the sovereign wealth fund model. I think that's partly because everybody during the global financial crisis discovered what a sovereign wealth fund was and decided that actually this might be something that we would want. So we do have traditional savings funds. We also have and stabilizations funds, which are either used to smooth out currency or to meet budgetary shortfalls. But I think where the real innovation is in countries that don't have a fiscal surplus, that are using state assets or allocations from their annual budgets to develop their home economies. And they're doing this on a financial basis, so it's all commercial, but they're really kind of doing, they can do a multitude of things. But primarily we're looking at kind of attracting FDI as one of the most popular and common ways we're seeing them. So acting as a partner of choice. Then we have kind of, investing in strategic sectors, helping develop capital markets is something that we're increasingly seeing. So there's a whole range of things that you can actually do with these funds, and that's where we've seen a real lot of innovation. And increasingly over the past, really since the pandemic, to be honest, we're seeing a lot of the funds being asked to do more than one thing, particularly where you don't have a very large amount of capital. So if you're looking in the Middle East, quite often you have a proliferation of funds and each have very specific mandates. In countries that don't have that kind of, embarrassment of riches, to put it in one way, that they're actually saying, this is a sovereign wealth fund, this is our center of financial excellence, and they're asking them to do maybe several things at once. That's what we call a hybrid model. And that's kind of where the main trend is at the moment, is looking at that.
Amazing. So I think what's interesting about what's happening here in the US right now in this conversation is certainly about kind of a national, kind of federal level fund, but there are state level funds already. And Angela, thankfully, can talk about the Alaska Permanent Fund as an excellent example of a state level fund that has done amazing things in terms of the investment, but also the intergenerational wealth for all Alaskans. So Angela, talk a little bit. I mean, Victoria just said there's a wide variety of use cases. This is a sovereign wealth fund. You say that you have it, and then it's obviously up to the state or the government to design it in a way that meets the mission or the goals that they have. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how that evolved at the Alaska Permanent Fund?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I think it's really important in this discussion as we look at a U.S. sovereign wealth fund possibility is that we really think about what we're creating, why we are creating it, and making sure that we are very clear and transparent about what the purpose is. So when I look at Alaska and what we created in Alaska, as many of you know, we had tremendous oil wealth that was found on the North Slope of Alaska. In 1976, the voters of Alaska voted for a constitutional amendment to save 25% of all royalties, fees, anything related to that oil would be saved in what was called the permanent fund. And notice I said it was a constitutional amendment. So a constitutional amendment meant that this savings requirement of 25% was mandatory. There was no way for future state legislatures to say, well, maybe this year it should be 10%, or maybe it should be 50%. It was a strict savings rule. And the income of the investments, so this money was to be invested according to the Constitution, and the income of that investment would then be used in any way that a state legislature wanted. So we kept the power of appropriation with the legislature. They would get the income and they would decide how to spend it. And that has been in place and has continued to grow for the last 45 plus years that it's now been in place. Today, we're debating the spending around this savings account and how it should be spent and where it should be spent. And when you look at sort of the practices of how to put these things together, what we've found in very successful sovereign wealth funds is not only do they have a savings rule, they also have a spending rule. 5% of market value, 2% of GDP. Pick your rule, but you are required to stick with that rule. And that allows this account to withstand any single generation priorities and allows you to create intergenerational wealth. So when we think about the U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund, I think it's going to be really important to articulate the why. What is it that we hope to accomplish with this, and the how, and what do the American people want to see as a result of participation in the Sovereign Wealth Fund community?
So I think building a little bit more on the rules that you mentioned, right? So there's the sovereign wealth funds generally across the board are not regulated. There's not some international body that does anything where it says, kind of you can do this or can't do that. There are Santiago principles that say this is what we think that you should do to run an effective and fair sovereign wealth fund. And so the guiding kind of principles there are around a lot of the rules that you're talking about in terms of capitalization, how you invest, but also your governance. Yep. And kind of the natural tension, because it is a government-owned fund traditionally, that then there is a political nature to it. And so how do you manage kind of all of those features? So Tarek, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of some of those best practices you've seen in terms of executing around the principles to ensure that there are kind of those effective design features?
Yeah, thanks, Kaylee. I mean, there are a lot of examples out there, and to Victoria's point earlier, I mean, these funds come in different sizes and shapes all around the world, from large funds to development funds to civilization funds. But I think the point really that's critical really is taking that purpose that's really defined early on of what is the problem set, what are we trying to solve by establishing this fund. Usually there is something that the country or the territory is trying to solve for, whether creating intergenerational wealth, whether it's stabilizing a budget, whether it's serving some sort of a purpose, or what we've seen in recent years, as Victoria alluded to, these strategic development funds or strategic investment funds, defining really what the outcome is and what the purpose is early on. That really helps articulate really the governance and the operating model of how that fund will need to operate. Because at the end of the day, really this fund is going to operate in a world of partner sovereign wealth funds, private capital and investors, and they're going to need to have a very competent operating model and structure that's going to be able to partner with those investors that want to partner with it. The other aspect of this as well is really building trust. Building trust in the community and with the American people that this is a fund that's really got the robust governance framework in there. It's able to hire the right talent to kind of execute on the mission. And it's transparent enough where there's clear, openness around how decisions are being made and what are the mandate and the investment criteria for this fund. So it's very critical. So it's like coming to think around the operational aspects of the fund is a good conversation to have, but without defining the top of the house and the mandate and purpose of the fund really makes it extremely difficult. So we really encourage a lot of countries. It takes a long time for them to get to that journey, but it's really a critical part of really ensuring a successful investment fund. And again, a lot of these funds that are being set up these days, they don't necessarily, wealth funds that necessarily have surplus capital. So it's really about defining the mandate up top, whether you're looking to attract capital, you're looking to deploy capital, you're looking to be a partner to inbound investors, whatever the case may be, but really well defining that and really articulating that to the market and to the constituency of the American people, really, so this could be something that's got a bipartisan support model. So that's really, really critical to kind of ensure success around something like this.
The last piece that you just mentioned in terms of getting the buy-in of the citizens, in this case the American people, but looking across kind of best practices and examples for anybody on the panel, is there a country or a fund that you think did a particularly good job in terms of saying, listen, we have this, kind of our mandate and our goal. Now we have to go to the citizens and say, we're making our case. This is what we're going to do. And we successfully brought them along to ensure that there was, kind of long-term support for the fund and its mission.
Victoria, so I think this is kind of one of these things that has become more important as time has gone on. And because we now live in a world where there is a proliferation of information of various types, I think that there is a greater expectation that citizens directly have an input into what this would look like, whereas previously, I think this is, even going back to the early 2000s when, like Australia and New Zealand were founded, that was very much a government-driven model. So, the government, it was all done through the normal legislative process. And I think now there is a greater drive to ensuring there is direct engagement with people. And I think the most two recent ones that I've seen that have had real kind of debate they may not necessarily be best practice, but they're the most obvious one.
Lesson learned.
Yes.
Yeah.
Namibia is currently setting up a fund, and that all went out to kind of massive amounts of civil society groups, and that has been a process that's been ongoing for, I think, 2 or 3 years now, to try and work out what the people want from this fund. Similarly, if you look at Ghana for their petroleum funds, they actually have a civil society advisory board and they were actually kind of, when those funds were set up in 2011, they were actually really intimately involved in creating what that was going to be for. And then I think you've got kind of the opposite happening, where sometimes that conversation isn't had, and ultimately you end up with people saying, well, how are we going to benefit from this institution? What is it going to do for us? Because we're expecting some form of benefit, and the government going, oh well, it's a fiscal piece of legislation that's going to help balance the budget. It's not going to give you any direct benefits. So I think I think this has become more important over time, rather because of this, kind of more social media, etc. And actually, I imagine the proliferation of disinformation as well. It becomes much more important to have a very much more open conversation.
Right. And so, go ahead, Anne.
I was going to say, I'm going to use Alaska. I'm biased, of course, but I think Alaska sort of sets up how this can work and work well, even after all the time that has passed. So you had a situation where oil is found, and the first lease sale in Alaska went and delivered $900 million to the state of Alaska at a time when the state budget was $150 million.
Yep.
And they blew the money that year, spent like crazy. Alaska was a young state. We became a state in 1959. We didn't have the infrastructure. We didn't have the roads, the schools, all the things that we take for granted down here in the lower 48. Blew through that $900 million, and the people of Alaska went, oh my goodness sakes, this is terrible, because this can't last. This is a finite resource. And to the credit of our leaders, business leaders, legislative, local leaders, Alaska Natives, we started a conversation about how do we preserve some of this wealth, because we know oil and gas can't last forever. Oh, by the way, at the time, it was expected to all be gone in 1997. We're still putting through 500,000 barrels a day. So we have this conversation. 75% of Alaskans vote for the constitutional amendment. And at the time, there was no discussion about how the money was going to be spent, only that it was important to save a portion of it.
Wow.
So there was no promise of a permanent fund dividend at the time. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Alaska, know that since 1982, every Alaskan man, woman, and child that has lived there for 12 months receives a permanent fund dividend. This is a source of great debate in the state right now. I had one of our political leaders say, please say the U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund will not have a dividend, okay? So I'm just saying, like, having that planned spend is key, but it's not necessary. And the fund's first deposit was $734,000, and the fund is over $80 billion today.
Right.
$16 billion is directly tied to the savings. The rest is all investment creation. So it is possible even today. But it's important to lead with the conversation, to build that trust, to build that understanding, and create the transparency into how, what, and most importantly, why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. So let's talk about the transparency piece, because historically, there has been criticism of kind of sovereign wealth funds across the board around transparency, and so that's why that is baked into the principles, Santiago principles, so strongly. And so, you've seen kind of an evolution of what they are willing to discuss and kind of thinking about, kind of how they engage the community around kind of investment strategy. So, what are some of those kind of best practices or examples that you think, Tark, do you want to take some of, kind of ensuring that there is transparency alongside, I think, kind of telling that story that Angela just mentioned around kind of long-termism. So thinking not just about what are we doing this year and what is the transparent, kind of the understanding of what's happening this year, but why it's also important for 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now.
Yep. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's even, if we bring it home here to the US, I mean, it's even more critical, I would argue, the transparency element, given most of the sovereign wealth funds we see around the world in today's world, especially if you look at, you know, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, these are mostly public sector driven economies. You know, the United States is a private sector driven economy for the most part. Right. How do you also build that transparency that this sovereign wealth fund will be accretive to the private sector, will not be a crowding kind of element to the private sector that will kind of interfere and get to do the things that the private sector can do already. You know, so defining that and having that transparent model where this fund will be a partner to the private sector. I mean, there are large scale investments that could be potential areas where the fund can get involved with. You know, whether what we hear a lot around technology and AI and data centers and energy areas, and there are large scale projects and investments, or ports and transportation and supply chains. There are a number of different strategic areas where a fund like this can get involved with, but how do you define this in your governance model, in your transparency model, with partners in the US, outside the US, where this fund can be something accretive, because it's not just enough to kind of write the check or you're able to kind of like be involved in this. No, it's actually more around how you're going to influence and impact this whole ecosystem, because it's not a one size or it's not a one partner. It's really a partner of a bunch of players that need to come into place here to make this a successful fund. So the fund is not going to operate on its own in a market on its own. So it needs to kind of have that well-defined operating model, that well-defined structure, and the transparency, which I do argue that it's even more relevant here in the United States, that it needs to be clear, the investment process, how investments are made, where the capital's coming, the spending rules, the everything around that needs to be clear, but also giving the fund the flexibility to kind of operate as a commercial investment fund that is tasked to execute on certain objectives, depending on what that ends up being. So it's really, really important, I would argue. So there's a lot of good examples, I mean, on transparency. I mean, you can look at the Singaporeans, you can look at the Norwegians. They've got really good governance and transparency models around those. But again, as Victoria would argue, I mean, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It really needs to be adapted to the market, to the constituency, to really the objectives of the fund.
And be able to be adaptable as that market shifts as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, and I also think that it is a ongoing conversation. So it's particularly where you have elections and you have different new sets of lawmakers every 4 years. You know, I mean, I'm actually going to talk to a whole bunch of parliamentarians for one of our members because they had an election like the rest of us last year, and just to keep telling them what the fund does, how sovereign wealth funds work, and it's a continuing debate, and it's a continuing trying to keep buy-in from stakeholders, and that is, you know, it is parliamentarians or lawmakers of whichever stripe you have, but it's also about continuing that conversation with citizens so they continue to understand why it's doing what it's doing. And to that end, you have to be really clear about, you know, not just putting data out there. So there used to be a trend of sovereign wealth funds saying, we're really transparent, we've put our audited accounts online. And I'm like, well, unless you're an accountant, that means nothing to you at all. You know, you're rummaging around in the notes trying to find the interesting stuff. So it's really about, what do you need to tell, to Tarek's point, what do you need to tell your partners and your commercial partners, and what do you need to tell your lawmakers, and what do you need to tell your citizens? And those are three different types of information, because they have three different types of interests in the institution. But it has to be continuous dialogue with all those three lines of stakeholders.
So we've talked about kind of the mission, the transparency, the engagement with the people. The sometimes biggest challenge is the governance, right? And setting it up from the beginning to be as removed from the kind of political process, let's say, not politics, but the political process as much as possible. Obviously a challenge for every country. So talk a little bit, you know, kind of who's seen some interesting examples of how to ensure, or, you know, that there's political autonomy, or, you know, countries that have had to shift their model because there were challenges and they, you know, kind of improved upon what they were doing.
Do you want to go ahead, Noel?
Angela, take the Alaska model, maybe?
Yeah.
Well, I was actually going to say, you know, Wyoming's permanent fund made some changes about 10 years ago under Governor Gordon to try and reduce political influence. And on the state, in the U.S. State Sovereign Wealth Fund, obviously the political influence can be closer than it would be in a large national sovereign like Norway. And he based a lot of it, or I should say Wyoming based a lot of it on the lessons learned out of Australia and New Zealand, and trying to create multiple levels of assigning or creating boards so that you created trust in the selections. It appears very meritocratic, and less, political allies. So, I think as you look out in the world, and the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds has great information on this. Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation has great trustee papers on this. There's a lot of really good work that has been done internationally by a number of scholars about how to create these boards, how to try and reduce. You're not going to eliminate it. These are government political animals at the end of the day, but you can do enough that really generates the trust that you need with all stakeholders, whether it's your investment partners, it's your shareholders in the form of the citizens who benefit from it, and any others who might come in. So, Tarek or Victoria, add on.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'd say this point around your governance model is really it's something that you'll adapt really over as the fund kind of continues to evolve over time. It's something that a lot of these funds kind of look at in a way where, at the end of the day, even if we're talking about the United States, this is a fund that's going to operate in the national interest of the United States, right? So that's kind of clear. That's part of the mandate that's there. But the clear important part around this is the investment decision making. Is there a clear process around this? And this is not happening in a way where it's directly coming from leadership that are not associated with the investment process or the commercial decision making. It's that you can build that transparency and that clear mandate, because that's how the partners in the private sector operate. That's how the partners that the fund is going to want to partner with to either attract capital into the country. That's how they mostly operate. So the fund is going to need to kind of build that to start with, evolve it over time. It's not something that you'll stick around and just park it and leave it alone forever, but it's something that I think you revisit, and that's kind of why the IFSWF does self-assessments every year and goes back.
I'm glad it's not every year. It's every
or every 3 years, kind of goes back to the funds and kind of tries to, hey, tell us really what you're doing and what's changed and how you're evolving. And
I mean that's why we do it every 3 years, is because that's enough time to show change. And I had a couple of members last time I asked for it go, I'm sure there's nothing's changed, and then they came back and go, yes, it has. But I'm sure that's not the same document. But I also think, to Tarek's point, is that with kind of being transparent, it is you need to make sure that it's adaptive. And I've actually just lost my train of thought, so I'll let you go on.
Well, so the adaptive piece of it, I think, in terms of the political process, obviously we change administrations, and this is not the first administration to suggest a sovereign wealth fund. And so the question of how you kind of adapt along with kind of the political will, but also the needs of the country, I think does potentially then change, or do you try to encourage a strict kind of governance framework to say, we are going to remain strong despite changes, or we're going to be flexible even in our governance based on the changes that we see we need in the country?
Yep, I agree. I mean, look, I'm definitely optimistic. Let's see what comes out, and we're the next, what we're supposed to see here come out in the spring. I'm pleased to see that Treasury and other parts of government have reached out to the private sector to kind of get input around this, an external advisory body to kind of think around the concept paper of what this sovereign wealth fund could look like. There's obviously the legal aspect of this, of how this will be structured and set up, but a lot of these questions are part of that. So let's see. I mean, I'm hopeful that this will be something that will be robust enough, will bring enough coalition and partners together, and it'll come up with something that's bipartisan in a way where it could get good coalition support.
So one other piece of criticism that we often see is why a sovereign wealth fund versus anything else that the government already does. So maybe, I don't know, Victoria, if you want to talk about some of the examples of countries that have existing types of development funds or savings funds, but have, you know, if you're Singapore, you have a GIC and you have a Temasek, you have a variety of different kind of entities. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how those work together? Because to your point, Tarek, about not wanting to you know, interject overly in the private sector activity, there also is public sector activity that is also happening, and funding and programs that happen at a state and local and federal level already. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how governments kind of manage the various pools of capital that they now have doing similar things? I
mean, I think that there is always a case of which you need. Going back to our point, this is a bit of a broken record, guys. You know that everybody, if you've got multiple institutions, they need to have their own mandate. But there also needs to be coordination at a government level of who does what. I think that's really important. But going back to this point about legislation is a really difficult balancing act of having, you know, overly prescriptive legislation is bad because it allows for no flexibility to change over time.
Right.
But if it's too lax, then you end up with, you know, bad governance. And good governance is important because it does drive better decision making. And I think that's really important. You know, it sounds very dull to keep going on about it, but ultimately the reason we exist is to make sure that that governance is good so that our members continue to deliver returns for their citizens. And it's, you know, I understand that it sounds quite dry, but it actually is essential to making good decision making and having good investment outcomes.
Yep.
So we have 1 minute, very quickly, rapid fire. If we have a sovereign wealth fund next year, what's the first thing, if you were controlling the money, that you would invest in? Tarek, go.
That's a good one.
What would you buy, and would you buy the White House? Go.
Not buy the White House, and don't buy TikTok, because that'll get you into a whole bunch of data privacy questions. So I would say probably an infrastructure, a large infrastructure investment that would really accelerate investments into the technology and AI space. I think there's room for that. I think whether it's through federal land, or it's through the partnerships with technology companies, or it's the partnership with some of the inbound investors that want to put a lot of money in this. We all know this is a big space that needs a lot of capital to go in there, and I think the federal government can play a role here in accelerating really and playing a catalyst role into that space.
Awesome. Angela.
Critical minerals, energy, transmission, grid, all of the above.
Excellent.
Everything what they said.
Fantastic. So now we've solved it. We've figured it out in 30 minutes. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Love to have.